The galaxy had watched humanity for 300 years, and humanity had watched back when the first alien signal reached Earth in the year 2157. The world celebrated for weeks, and people danced in the streets because they finally knew they were not alone in the universe. The Galactic Concord sent their finest diplomats to welcome humanity into the fold, and they arrived with gifts of technology and promises of trade routes that would make Earth wealthy beyond imagination. But the humans said no. They said it politely, and they said it with respect, but they said no, and they kept saying no. For 300 years, Ambassador Velith of the Korathi Dominion remembered the stories her grandmother had told her about those early days, when the elder races had laughed at the primitive humans who refused to join galactic civilization. They will come around. The Arishi High Council had declared, they always do when they see what they are missing. But humanity never came around. They built their own ships, and they explored their own corner of space, and they claimed exactly 12 star systems, and not one more, and they traded with no one, and they allied with no one, and they simply existed in their quiet little sphere while the great empires rose and fell around them. Velith had studied human history at the finest academy on her homeworld, and she thought she understood them better than most of her colleagues. She knew they had fought terrible wars among themselves before achieving unity, and she knew they had nearly destroyed their own planet before learning to live in balance with nature, and she knew they valued something called justice above almost everything else. But knowing these things did not prepare her for what she found when she finally traveled to Earth. The human capital was not what she expected. She had visited the grand halls of the Areshi Imperium, where columns of living crystal sang hymns to fallen emperors, and she had walked the endless gardens of the Mandari remnant, where flowers bloomed in colors that existed nowhere else in the universe, and she had stood in the shadow of the Korathi war monuments that stretched so high they scraped against the clouds. The human capital was simple. It was a city of modest buildings and green spaces and people who walked to work instead of riding in hover vehicles, and children who played in parks instead of training academies. Velith found it unsettling in a way she could not explain. Director Chun met her at the landing platform, and Velith was surprised to find that the most powerful human on Earth was a small woman with gray hair and deep lines around her eyes. Ambassador Velith, Chun said, and her voice was warm but her eyes were not. We have been expecting you. I am honored to be received. Velith replied with a formal bow. I bring greetings from the Korfi Dominion and a renewed offer of partnership between our peoples. Chun nodded and gestured for Velith to follow her. They walked through the halls of the human government building, and Velith noticed that there were no guards and no weapons and no signs of the military might that every other spacefaring civilization displayed so proudly. You must wonder why we keep refusing, Chum said as they walked. The question has occupied many minds for many centuries. Velith admitted Chun stopped in front of a simple wooden door and turned to face her guest. We have our reasons, she said, and today, for the first time, we are going to share them with someone outside our borders. She opened the door and led Velith into a room that contained nothing but a table and 2 chairs and a small data crystal sitting on a velvet cloth. Please sit, Chun said. Velith sat, and Chun sat across from her, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. 312 years ago, Chun finally said, when your people first contacted us, we were overjoyed, and we were terrified, and we were curious beyond measure. She picked up the data crystal and held it in her palm. We wanted to join you, she continued. We wanted to explore the stars and meet new species and become part of something greater than ourselves. Then why did you refuse? Velith asked. Chun smiled, but it was not a happy smile. Because we decided to watch first, she said. We decided to learn who you really were before we committed ourselves to your civilization. She placed the crystal on the table between them. We have been watching ever since. She said, "We've been listening to your communications and studying your histories and documenting your actions, and we have compiled everything we learned into this crystal." Bayless stared at the small object and felt a chill run through her body. "What is on that crystal?" she asked. "Evidence," Chun said. 312 years of evidence. Evidence of what? Chun leaned forward and her eyes were hard as stone. "Everything," she said. "Every secret treaty and every hidden war and every species that vanished after first contact. And every crime that the great empires of the Galactic Concord have committed and covered up for millennia." Bayleth felt her hearts begin to race. "That is impossible," she said. "Our security systems are the finest in the galaxy, and no one could have gathered such information without detection." "We are patient," Chun said, "and we are very good at watching without being seen." She pushed the crystal across the table toward Bayleth. "Take it," she said. "See for yourself what kind of civilization you have asked us to join." Bayleth reached out with trembling hands and picked up the crystal. "Why are you showing me this?" she asked. "Why now after all these centuries of silence?" Chun stood and walked to the window and looked out at the peaceful city below. "Because 3 days ago," she said, "a species called the Velith made first contact with a Concord exploration vessel in the outer reach." She turned back to face Velith. "The Concord Arbitration Council meets in 40 cycles to decide the fate of the Velith," she said. "We know what the council will decide because we have seen this happen before, and we have the records of every other time it has happened." Her voice was cold and hard. "We know what always happens to young species who catch the attention of the elder races," she said, "and we have decided that this time it will not happen." Bayleth clutched the crystal and stared at the human woman, who spoke so calmly about challenging the greatest powers in the known universe. "What are you going to do?" she whispered. Chung walked back to the table and placed both hands flat on its surface and leaned toward her guest. "We are going to bring judgment," she said, "and the galaxy will never be the same." Bayleth returned to her ship that night and locked herself in her private quarters and inserted the data crystal into her console. She told herself she would only look for a few minutes because surely the humans were exaggerating and surely the Galactic Concord was not built on the foundations of horror and lies. 7 hours later, she was still watching, and tears streamed down her face, and she understood why the humans had stayed silent for 300 years. The first file was labeled "The Pelori Extinction," and it began with a simple statement of facts. The Pelori had been a peaceful species who lived on a world rich in minerals that the Orishi Imperium wanted for their shipyards, and the Concord's official history said that a mysterious plague had wiped out the Pelori. Before any meaningful contact could be established, the humans had found the truth. The footage showed Irashi warships entering the Pelori system, and the Pelori sending messages of greeting and welcome, and the Irashi responding with silence. Then the bombs fell. They were not ordinary bombs, but biological weapons designed to target Pelori physiology and leave everything else untouched, and the humans had recorded transmissions between Irashi commanders laughing about how the primitive creatures were dying by the millions. Bayleth watched the last Pelori city burn, and she watched Irashi soldiers walking through streets filled with corpses, and she watched them plant evidence of a natural plague that would fool Concord investigators for centuries. She wanted to stop, but she could not. The next file was labeled "The Mendari Absorption," and Bayleth felt her stomach turn because her own people, the Karthi, had been involved in this one. The official history said that the Mendari had willingly joined the Karthi Dominion after recognizing the benefits of Concord membership. The truth was different. The humans had recordings of Korethi soldiers separating Mendari children from their families and sending them to education centers, where they were taught to forget their own language and culture and history. They had recordings of Mendari elders being executed for teaching traditional songs to young people. They had recordings of Karathi officials discussing how long it would take to completely erase Mandari identity and make them into proper servants of the Dominion. Velith recognized some of the voices in those recordings, and she recognized some of the faces, and she realized that the heroes of her childhood, the great leaders she had been taught to admire, were monsters who had destroyed an entire civilization and called it progress. File after file told the same story. The Tirani who had been forcibly relocated from their homeworld so that the Ereshi could strip mine their sacred mountains. The Vasek who had been experimented on to develop new weapons for the Concord military. The Brevani who had been enslaved to build the great stations that the elder races used for trade and diplomacy. 17 species had vanished from the galaxy since the Concord was founded, and the humans had documented the fate of every single one. They had not died from plagues or natural disasters or wars among themselves. They had been murdered and enslaved, and erased by the very civilizations that claimed to bring peace and prosperity to the galaxy. And then Velith found the file labeled Current Operations, and she learned that it was still happening. The Ereshi were developing a new biological weapon to use against a species called the Travani, who had refused to grant mining rights to their asteroid belts. The Karathi were planning to annex 3 independent systems whose governments had rejected Dominion protection and the Concord arbitration. Council had already decided what to do with the Velith. They would be offered membership in the Concord, and if they accepted, they would slowly be absorbed, and their culture would be erased and their resources would be exploited until nothing remained. But a footnote in history: if they refused, they would be destroyed, and the galaxy would be told they had died from a tragic accident, or a civil war, or a plague. It was all documented in communications the humans had intercepted and meetings the humans had somehow recorded, and plans that were supposed to be known only to the highest levels of Concord leadership. Velith sat in the darkness of her quarters and stared at the screen and tried to understand how her entire civilization could be built on such foundations of blood and lies. She thought about her grandmother, who had served in the Karathi military and who had told stories of bringing peace to troubled worlds. She thought about her teachers, who had explained how the Concord protected weaker species from their own primitive impulses. She thought about everything she had believed her entire life, and she watched it crumble into dust. The console chimed and Director Chun's face appeared on the screen. "You have seen enough," Chun said, and it was not a question. "How?" Velith whispered. "How did you gather all of this without anyone knowing?" "We are patient," Chun said again, "and we learned very quickly that the galaxy was not what it appeared to be, so we dedicated ourselves to finding the truth." "But why?" Velith asked. "Why spend 300 years gathering evidence instead of exposing these crimes when you first discovered them?" Chen's expression softened just slightly. "Because we needed to be certain," she said, "and because we needed to gather enough evidence that no one could deny what had been done, and because we needed to wait for the right moment." "The Velith," Velith said. "Yes," Chun confirmed. "The Velith are about to become the next victims, and we will not allow that to happen." Velith looked at the crystal that contained 3 centuries of horrors, and she made a decision that would change everything. "What do you need me to do?" she asked. Chun smiled, and for the first time it reached her eyes. "We need you to go home," she said, "and we need you to wait, and we need you to be ready." "Ready for what?" "Ready for judgment," Chun said. "It is coming, and when it arrives, nothing will ever be the same." The Concord Arbitration Council gathered on Axis Prime, the greatest space station ever built, a monument to the power and wisdom of the elder races. Representatives from every major species took their seats in the Grand Chamber, and they prepared to decide the fate of the Velith, as they had decided the fate of so many species before High Arbiter Korvax of the Arishi Imperium called the session to order, and his voice echoed through the chamber with the weight of centuries of tradition. We are gathered to discuss the integration of the Velith species into our galactic community. He announced, "The matter has been studied and recommendations have been prepared." He paused and looked around the chamber at the familiar faces of his fellow arbiters, and he felt satisfied that everything would proceed as planned. The Velith homeworld contains significant deposits of quantum crystals. He continued, "These resources would benefit the entire Concord, and it is our duty to ensure they are properly managed." The other arbiters nodded and murmured their agreement, and none of them noticed the lights on their communication panels beginning to blink. Furthermore, Korvax said, "The Velith have shown concerning signs of independent development, and we must guide them toward proper integration before they become a threat to galactic stability." He was about to continue when the chamber doors burst open, and a junior officer rushed in with terror on his face. "High Arbiter!" The officer shouted. "Ships! Thousands of ships are emerging from fold space around the station." Korvax rose from his seat and demanded, "What species? What configuration? Are we under attack?" The officer's voice trembled as he answered, "They are human ships, High Arbiter, but they carry no weapons that our sensors can detect, and they are broadcasting on every frequency in the galaxy." Korvax felt ice form in his heart. "Broadcasting what?" he asked. Before the officer could answer, every screen in the chamber activated and showed the same image, a human face. An old man with dark skin and white hair and eyes that held the weight of terrible knowledge. "My name is Admiral Marcus Okonkwo," the human said, "and I speak to every citizen of the Galactic Concord." Korvax rushed to the communications panel and tried to shut down the broadcast, but nothing worked, and he realized with horror that the humans had taken control of every communication system in the Concord for 300 years. Admiral Okonkwo continued, "Humanity has watched your civilization from the shadows, and we have seen what you truly are beneath the monuments and the treaties and the grand declarations of peace." The screen split to show images that Korvax recognized instantly, and his blood turned to ice. Images of Areshi warships bombing the Palori homeworld, images of Korathi soldiers dragging Mandara children from their parents, images of secret laboratories where prisoners were dissected in the name of science. "You have built your civilization on the bones of murdered innocents," Admiral Okonkwo said. "You have erased cultures and enslaved peoples and called it progress, and you have done it so many times that you have forgotten it is wrong." Across the galaxy, billions of beings stopped what they were doing and watched their screens in disbelief on the Areshi homeworld. A young soldier named Thevris watched footage of his own military committing genocide, and he remembered his grandfather, who had served in that campaign and who had always refused to speak about it on Korathi Prime. A teacher named Saleth watched recordings of children being torn from their families, and she thought about her Mandari students who had no memory of their own history, and she began to understand why on 100,000 worlds, citizens of the Concord learned the truth about their leaders and their heroes and their glorious history. "We are not here to conquer you," Admiral Okonkwo said. "We carry no weapons, and we seek no territory, and we want nothing from you except this. We want you to see." The footage continued, and it showed every crime the humans had documented over 3 centuries, and it named every leader who had ordered atrocities, and every soldier who had carried them out, and every official who had covered up the truth. "The Velith are about to become your next victims," Admiral Okonkwo said. "Your arbitration council has already decided to absorb them and erase their culture, just as you erased so many others." High Arbiter Korvax watched his own face appear on the screen as recordings played of him discussing how to manipulate the Velith and how to extract their resources and how to eliminate them if they resisted. "We will not allow this to continue," Admiral Okonkwo said. "Not because we are stronger than you, and not because we want to rule in your place, but because someone must finally say that enough is enough." He paused, and the screen showed the human fleet surrounding Axis Prime. 12,000 ships hanging in space like silent judges. We bring you no weapons, he said. Only truth, and truth is the most powerful weapon in the universe, because you cannot defeat it, and you cannot hide from it, and you cannot pretend it does not exist. He leaned forward, and his eyes seemed to look directly at every viewer in the galaxy. We did not come for glory, he said. We came to bring judgment, and now that judgment has arrived. What you do next is up to you. The broadcast ended, but the screens continued to display evidence and testimony and documentation, and across the galaxy, the people of the Concord began to react on the Arishi homeworld. Crowds gathered outside the government buildings and demanded answers on Corythi Prime. Military units refused orders to suppress protests on Axis Prime itself. The arbiters sat in stunned silence while outside their chamber the station's crew began to argue about what they had seen. High Arbiter Korvax looked at his fellow leaders and saw fear in their eyes, and he knew that the world they had built was crumbling around them. What do we do? Someone asked. No one had an answer because, for the first time in the history of the Galactic Concord, the truth had been spoken and everyone had heard it, and nothing would ever be the same again. The humans had not fired a single shot. They had not needed to. They had simply held up a mirror, and the galaxy had finally seen its own face. The galaxy burned, but not with fire. It burned with truth, and the flames consumed everything the Elder races had built on the Arishi homeworld. The High Council fell within 3 days of the broadcast, and it was their own military that brought them down because soldiers who had been taught they were heroes learned they were servants of monsters. General Thevris, the young man who had watched his grandfather's crimes exposed to the galaxy, led his troops into the capital and arrested the counselors who had ordered genocides and the admirals who had carried them out. We will have justice, he told the crowds that gathered to watch. Not the justice of vengeance, but the justice of truth on Corythi Prime. The Dominion shattered into a dozen fragments as subject species rose up and demanded independence, and client worlds that had served the Corythi for centuries declared they would serve no more. Ambassador Valith watched from her estate as everything she had known collapsed, and she felt something strange in her heart's relief. She had carried the weight of the humans' evidence for only a few weeks, but that weight had nearly crushed her, and now that everyone knew the truth, she could finally breathe again. Chaos spread across every world in the Concord, and governments fell, and alliances, broken systems that had been stable for millennia, descended into confusion. And then the human ships arrived, not warships this time, but medical frigates and cargo vessels and rescue shuttles painted white with simple symbols of aid. They landed on worlds torn by revolution, and they set up hospitals in the ruins of government buildings, and they distributed food and water and medicine to anyone who needed help, regardless of species or politics. A young Corythi officer named Tavros stood in the rubble of what had been his city's administrative center and watched humans in white uniforms treating wounded civilians. He had fought against the revolution at first because he believed in order and stability and the traditions of his people, but then he had seen the evidence, and he had understood that the order he served was built on suffering. Now he did not know what to believe. He approached one of the human medics, a woman with red hair and tired eyes who was bandaging the arm of a Corythi child. "Why are you helping us?" he asked. The woman looked up at him, and her face showed no anger and no judgment. "Because you are hurt," she said simply. "But your people caused this," Tavros said. "Your broadcast destroyed our government and our society and everything we built." The woman finished the bandage and sent the child to her mother, and then she stood and faced the Corythi officer. "Your government destroyed itself," she said. We only showed people what it really was, and they made their own choices about what to do with that knowledge. But why help us now? Tavros demanded. You could claim our territory and take our resources and make us serve you as we made others serve us. The woman tilted her head and looked at him with something like sadness. Is that what you would do? She asked. If you had the power we have, is that what you would choose? Tavros did not answer because he did not know the answer. We did not do this to destroy you, the woman said. We did this to stop what was about to happen to the Velith, because we have watched species after species be consumed by your civilization, and we could not watch it happen again. She gestured at the chaos around them. The empires had to fall, she said. But the people who lived under those empires did not deserve to suffer for the crimes of their leaders. Tavros thought about the Mandari servants who had worked in his family's home when he was a child, and he remembered how they had always seemed sad and quiet, and now he understood why. How can you forgive us? He asked. The woman smiled, but it was not a happy smile. Forgiveness is not ours to give, she said. That belongs to the Pelori who are all dead, and the Mandari whose culture was erased, and all the others who suffered under your civilization. She picked up her medical kit and prepared to move to the next patient. What we offer is not forgiveness, she said. What we offer is a chance to become something better than what you were. Tavros watched her walk away, and he stood in the daze. Ruins of everything he had known, and he made a choice. He took off his uniform jacket with its medals and its symbols of rank, and he walked to the nearest human aid station. And he asked how he could help. The humans did not question him, and they did not judge him, and they simply handed him supplies and showed him where to go. And as he worked alongside his former enemies to help his own wounded people, Tavros began to understand something that his civilization had forgotten long ago. Power was not about controlling others. Power was about choosing what kind of being you wanted to be. The humans had shown the galaxy its reflection, and now every person in the Concord had to decide whether to look away or to face the truth and become something new. It was the hardest choice any of them had ever made, and it was exactly the choice the humans had wanted them to face all along. 1 year after the broadcast that shattered the Galactic Concord, representatives from 47 species gathered on a station that had not existed 12 months before. The humans had built it in neutral space, far from the territory of any former empire. And they had built it as a gift for the galaxy they had transformed. It was called Haven, and it was designed to be a place where anyone could speak and anyone could listen, and no one would be silenced because of their species or their history. Velith stood at the entrance to the Great Assembly Hall and watched delegates arrive from worlds that had been at war with each other. Just months ago, she saw Ereshi reformists walking beside Pelori descendants who had been found hiding on remote colony worlds, survivors of a genocide that everyone had finally acknowledged. She saw Korathi officers who had surrendered their ranks standing next to Mandari, elders who were teaching their children the songs that had been forbidden for generations. She saw the Velith, the species whose near enslavement had triggered humanity's intervention, walking with their heads held high because they had learned the truth in time to avoid the fate of so many others. And she saw humans everywhere, not commanding or directing, but simply present, watching and listening and helping where they were needed. Admiral Okonkwo took the central podium, and the assembly fell silent. He looked older than he had in the broadcast, as if the weight of what he had done had aged him years in just 12 months. "Thank you for coming," he said, and his voice was quiet and tired. "I know many of you have traveled far, and I know many of you still have reason to distrust each other and to distrust us." He paused and looked across the gathered delegates. "We watched you for 3 centuries, he said. "We saw what you did when you thought no one was looking, and we saw the pattern that repeated every time a new species was discovered. The strong consumed the weak and called it civilization. He gripped the podium and his hands trembled slightly. We could have joined you, he said. We have the technology and the resources, and we could have played your games and made our fortunes and looked away from the suffering, because it was not our problem. His voice hardened. We chose not to, he said, because we have seen where that road leads, and we have walked it ourselves long ago, and we remember the cost. The assembly listened in silence as the old admiral spoke. Before we achieved unity on Earth, our species committed terrible crimes against itself, he said. We enslaved each other, and we conquered each other, and we committed genocides that we still struggle to comprehend. He looked down at his hands. We learned from our mistakes, he said, and we swore that we would never repeat them, and that if we ever found others making the same mistakes, we would do whatever we could to stop them. He raised his eyes to the assembly. That is why we watched, he said. That is why. We gathered evidence, and that is why we waited for the right moment to reveal the truth. A Veloth delegate rose on trembling limbs. You saved us, she said. Before we even knew we needed saving, and before we understood the danger we faced. Admiral Okonkwo nodded. We saw what was about to happen to your people, he said, and we could not let it happen again. But why? The Veloth asked. You owed us nothing, and you had never met us, and you risked everything to protect strangers. The Admiral was silent for a long moment, because we remember what it was like to be young and alone, and at the mercy of those who saw us as less than equal. He finally said, when we were struggling to survive on Earth, when we were making all our terrible mistakes, we had no one to guide us and no one to warn us and no one to help us become better than we were. His voice softened. Someone should have been there for us, he said. No one was, so we decided to become the ones who would be there for others. The assembly stirred, and delegates looked at each other and tried to understand a species that would wait 3 centuries and challenge the greatest powers in the galaxy for the sake of strangers they had never met. Valeth thought about all the years she had spent believing in the Concord, and she thought about the weight of knowledge she now carried, and she raised her hand to speak. What happens now? She asked. The empires have fallen, and billions of people are struggling to rebuild, and the galaxy is more dangerous and unstable than it has been in millennia. Admiral Okonkwo smiled, and it was a tired smile, but it was real. That is not for us to decide, he said. We did not shatter the old order so that we could build a new one in our own image. He stepped back from the podium. The question is not what humanity will do, he said. The question is what all of you will build together now that the lies are gone. The assembly erupted in voices as delegates began to argue and debate and discuss the future of their species and their worlds. But Valeth noticed something strange. The humans were not participating. They sat in their seats. And they listened, but they did not speak, and they did not try to influence the debate. And they simply watched as the galaxy began the long process of healing. She found Director Chun standing at the edge of the assembly hall, and she approached. The human woman who had first shown her the truth. You really are not going to take power, are you? Valeth asked. Chun shook her head. We never wanted power, she said. We wanted justice, but you could rule the galaxy now. Valeth said, no one could stop you, and everyone owes you a debt they can never repay. Chun looked at the assembly hall, where dozens of species were struggling to find common ground. Ruling through debt is just another form of empire, she said, and we did not burn down the old empires just to build a new one. She turned to face Valeth directly. The greatest gift we can give the galaxy is not our leadership, she said. It is the freedom to make its own choices without being manipulated or controlled. Valeth watched the debates continue, and she saw former enemies beginning to listen to each other, and she saw the first fragile threads of trust being woven between species that have been at war for generations. Do you think they will succeed? She asked. Chun smiled. I do not know, she admitted. But for the first time in galactic history, they have a real chance to try. Valith nodded and walked back toward the assembly hall where the future was being written by beings who had finally been freed from the lies of the past. And behind her, Director Chun stood with Admiral Okonkwo, and they watched the galaxy take its first steps toward becoming something new. The humans had not sought glory. They had brought judgment. And now they stepped back to let others build what came next, because that, in the end, was the truest form of power. The strength to change everything and then trust others with the future. The galaxy would remember what humanity had done, and perhaps, one day, they would understand why.